In the small town of Eldridge, nestled between the whispering pines and the craggy face of Mount Ellery, the rare solar eclipse was the talk of every table, the whisper in the darkened corners of the Rusty Nail Tavern. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime spectacle," they said, their voices a mixture of excitement and a hint of reverence for the celestial event. The sky, a canvas of endless blue, promised nothing but the extraordinary. Children ran through the streets with cardboard glasses, their laughter echoing off the walls of the old, weather-beaten houses. Mrs. Thompson, the librarian, adjusted her glasses and peered up at the sky, her face a mask of concern hidden behind a polite smile. "They say it's a doorway to another world," she muttered to no one in particular as she set up a telescope in her front yard. Her neighbor, Bill, a man whose skin was as weathered as his barn, chuckled as he leaned on the fence. "A doorway, huh? Maybe it'll lead to a place where my tomatoes can grow without those damn rabbits," he joked, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. As the moon began its slow dance across the sun, a hush fell over Eldridge. The light dimmed as if the day were holding its breath, casting shadows that seemed too deep, too dark, too eager to stretch and swallow the land whole. The air turned cool, and the animals, sensing the shift, retreated into silence. Jenny, a young girl with braids, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Why does it feel like the world's going to sleep?" she whispered. Her mother, squeezing her hand, had no answer, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky, searching for a promise of light that seemed increasingly reluctant to return. The darkness was complete, a velvet blanket that smothered every trace of afternoon warmth. Under this eerie twilight, the town of Eldridge stood still, a picture frozen in time, waiting for the sun to pierce through the shadow. But the light that followed was not the sun. It was artificial, flickering from candles and flashlights, a feeble attempt to stave off the unrelenting night. "It's supposed to be over by now," someone murmured from the crowd gathered in the square, their faces ghostly in the glow of their makeshift torches. Silence was the only reply, a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to mock their attempts to understand, to control, to illuminate. The eclipse had passed, but the darkness remained, a tangible presence that whispered of a night that might never end. Darkness wrapped around Eldridge like a cloak, unrelenting and all-consuming. In the wake of the eclipse, the absence of sunlight cast a perpetual shadow over the town, as though the very essence of light had been drained, leaving a world painted in only grays and stark blacks. The citizens tread this dim reality with increasing trepidation, their expressions weary and gaunt from the endless night. The meager light from candles flickering in windows only served to cast eerie, dancing shadows that appeared to move with a life of their own. Within the confines of the Thompson home, the darkness pressed down with tangible force on Mrs. Thompson. Each day, in a time that bore no resemblance to morning anymore, she would gaze out her front window into the void, longing for a glimpse of daylight that never arrived. "This isn't natural," she would murmur, finding scant comfort in her own voice amidst the stifling quiet. Her husband, once a man of action, now roamed their home at night, restless, offering hopeful assurances that felt hollow. "The experts will solve this," he attempted to reassure, though doubt tinged his words. The striking of the grandfather clock, loud in their silent abode, served as a jarring reminder of time's passage in the dark. The town's children experienced the darkness with intensified fear, their young minds alight with the ominous stories shared by adults. Jenny, previously a child of sunlight, now stayed close to her mother, haunted by nightmares of lurking shadows. "The boogeyman thrives in darkness," she'd whisper, her gaze darting fearfully in the dimness of her room at night. Her mother, overwhelmed by a sense of powerlessness, could only embrace her, offering tales of brightness and hope, tales that felt increasingly like fables. In the Rusty Nail Tavern, what began as hopeful discussions turned to resigned concession. "Perhaps this is the end," Bill said quietly over his beer, avoiding eye contact. His attempt at humor was lost, swallowed by the melancholy that had seeped into the tavern's walls, transforming a once jovial place into a haven for those seeking to flee the oppressive feel of their homes, even briefly. The darkness brought with it a penetrating cold that nestled into every corner and soul, igniting fires that never ceased, their smoke a constant reminder of the town's plight. This cold wasn't merely physical, but touched a deeper, more existential chill, as the community realized the world had changed in ways beyond repair. This cold drove them to seek warmth not just from the fire, but from the company of each other, even as conversations faded into silent vigils around the flames, a silent protest against the darkness. As the eternal night wore on, Eldridge's social fabric began to unravel. Minor conflicts escalated, suspicions grew, and the once tight-knit community broke into isolated fragments, each person an island in an ocean of dark. "We're on our own," Mrs. Thompson overheard, a statement that echoed her own fears. In trying to preserve normality, everyone had withdrawn, isolating themselves within the dimming light of their personal sanctuaries. Fear took root, not of the dark itself, but of what it might hide. Figures barely glimpsed, sounds almost heard. The children named these presences shadows, new companions birthed from the dark. Yet their presence brought no comfort, their whispers no joy. Weeks passed without sign or hope, the town's resources and spirits flagging. Generators failed, lights flickered out, and with them, the last vestiges of hope dimmed. Eldridge faced the possibility that beyond their small enclave of darkness, the rest of the world, bathed in light, might no longer exist. "What if we're all that remains?" Mrs. Thompson voiced one night, her query hanging in a silence filled with dread. Without answers, they confronted a reality too daunting to fully embrace. In the heart of Eldridge's unending night, a more sinister transformation began to unfold, one that whispered of ancient fears and primal horrors. Mrs. Thompson, once the beacon of rational thought and skepticism, could not ignore the changes any longer. She noticed it first in Mr. Hargraves, the butcher, whose once jovial demeanor had turned dark, his eyes hollow, as if something vital had been scooped out from within. She watched him from her window, his movements erratic as he spoke to shadows that danced just beyond the reach of the streetlights. The whispers in the town grew louder, tales of figures seen in the peripheries, of friends and family members whose features seemed subtly, disturbingly altered. "It's like they're not quite themselves anymore," Bill confided to Mrs. Thompson, his voice low, as if afraid of being overheard. "It's like the dark's gotten inside them." His eyes darted around nervously, the light from the candle casting unsettling shadows across his face. Jenny, clutching her mother's hand, spoke of her friend Tommy, who no longer wanted to play but instead stared into the dark, whispering secrets to someone she could not see. "He's different, Mommy," she said, a tremble in her voice. "It's like he's looking at something far away, something we can't see." Her mother's heart raced, the terror of losing her daughter to the same unseen call, a constant weight on her chest. One evening, as the last light from their dwindling supply of candles flickered and threatened to die, Mrs. Thompson ventured into the heart of the town, driven by a need to understand, to confront the growing horror. The streets of Eldridge, once familiar and safe, now seemed alien and menacing. The darkness pressed in from all sides, a physical force that seemed to breathe, to watch. In the town square, she found a group of townsfolk, their faces gaunt, their eyes shining with an unnatural light. They stood in a circle, heads tilted upwards as if basking in moonlight that no longer shone. Their lips moved in unison, chanting words that twisted in the air, a language that belonged to the night. Mrs. Thompson, hidden in the shadows, felt a chill that went beyond the cold, a primal fear that rooted her to the spot. Suddenly, the group turned, as if sensing her presence. Their faces were no longer human, twisted into grotesque parodies of joy and welcome. "Join us," they called, their voices a chorus that echoed in the empty streets. "Become one with the darkness." Mrs. Thompson ran, the sound of her heart pounding louder than her footsteps, the terror of what she had seen fueling her flight. Back in her home, with the doors locked and the windows barred, Mrs. Thompson tried to make sense of what Eldridge had become. The town, isolated by the unending night, had transformed into a realm of nightmares, where the people she had known and loved were losing their humanity, succumbing to some ancient, dark influence. The realization that this darkness could take her family too, turning them into strangers, was a horror she could not bear. The night was no longer silent, filled instead with the sounds of transformation and terror. Screams pierced the darkness, not of fear, but of something else, something exultant. The boundaries between human and monster, reality and nightmare, blurred into insignificance. Eldridge, swallowed by the never-ending night, had become a place of unspeakable horror, where the darkness was alive, feeding on the souls of its inhabitants, transforming them into creatures of the night. Mrs. Thompson, holding Jenny close, whispered into the darkness, a plea for light that she knew would not be answered. The darkness had won, and their only hope was to survive, to hold on to their humanity for as long as they could. The descent into madness within the heart of Eldridge was as silent as the falling snow that no longer came, a quiet undoing of the fabric that held the community together. Mrs. Thompson felt it in the air, a suffocating blanket of dread that settled over everything, making each breath a labor. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It was a presence, a weight that bore down on them, squeezing the hope from their hearts with cold, unrelenting fingers. The whispers of transformation and horror that had once been shared in hushed tones were now spoken openly, a testament to the inescapable truth that something profoundly wrong had taken root. Inside her once cozy home, the atmosphere was charged with a palpable tension, a constant vigil against the darkness outside and the fear within. "We can't trust anyone anymore," her husband muttered, peering through the curtains at the shadowed figures that roamed the streets. His voice, once steady and reassuring, now trembled with an edge of paranoia. The trust that had once bound the community was eroding, replaced by suspicion and fear. Friends and neighbors eyed each other warily, unsure of who or what they might encounter in the once familiar faces. One night, as Mrs. Thompson and her family huddled together, the fragile barrier they had erected against the darkness was breached. A loud knock echoed through the house, a sound so alien and unexpected that it sent shivers down their spines. "Don't answer it," her husband whispered fiercely, but the knocking persisted, more insistent, more desperate. Against her better judgment, Mrs. Thompson approached the door, every fiber of her being screaming in protest. What lay beyond was unknown, a horror that her mind recoiled from imagining. With a trembling hand, she opened the door to find Mr. Hargraves, his eyes wild, his face a ghastly palette of fear. "They're coming," he gasped, a thin line of drool trailing from his mouth, his voice barely a whisper. "The shadows, they're alive." Before she could respond, he collapsed, a heap of broken humanity on her doorstep. As she knelt beside him, the air around them stirred, a whisper of movement that hinted at unseen watchers. The darkness, it seemed, had grown bold, no longer content to linger in the peripheries. In the days that followed, the descent into chaos accelerated. The streets of Eldridge became a labyrinth of nightmares, where unspeakable things moved in the gloom. The townsfolk, those who remained, transformed into grotesque parodies of themselves, their humanity stripped away, leaving only hunger and madness. Mrs. Thompson, her family her only anchor, watched as the world she knew disintegrated into madness and horror. The once vibrant community of Eldridge was now a ghost town, its soul lost to the darkness, its inhabitants trapped in a descent from which there was no escape. The final stand of the remaining inhabitants of Eldridge was not marked by heroics or grand gestures, but by a desperate, clinging hope to whatever shreds of normalcy and humanity they could muster in the face of the enveloping darkness. Mrs. Thompson, once a simple librarian, found herself the unlikely leader of this dwindling group of survivors. They had chosen the school as their sanctuary, its once cheerful halls now fortified against the nightmares that roamed outside. The large windows were boarded up, the classrooms transformed into makeshift living quarters, the echoes of children's laughter replaced by the somber silence of those waiting for an end. One night, as the darkness pressed in with almost tangible force, a plan began to form in Mrs. Thompson's mind. Escape, a word that had seemed as fantastical as the fairy tales she used to read, suddenly took on the weight of possibility. "We can't stay here forever," she whispered to her husband, her voice a fragile thread in the darkness. "There has to be somewhere, something beyond this. Nightmare." The conviction in her voice belied the fear that gripped her heart, a fear not just for herself, but for her daughter, Jenny, whose wide eyes held too much understanding of their grim reality. The decision was made with the heaviness of those who know they might not survive to see the consequences of their actions. Under the cover of the darkest hour, when even the shadows seemed to hold their breath, they would leave the school, their fortress, and attempt to find a world untouched by the darkness that had claimed Eldridge. The night before their departure was spent in silence, each person lost in their thoughts, their fears, and their memories of a world bathed in sunlight. When the time came, Mrs. Thompson led her small band of survivors through the silent hallways of the school, every step an act of defiance against the darkness. They stepped out into the night, and the door closed behind them with a finality that echoed in their bones. The streets of Eldridge, familiar yet utterly alien under the cloak of perpetual night, stretched out before them, a maze of shadows and despair. The air was filled with the sounds of their departure, a chorus of soft footsteps and stifled breaths, as they made their way through the town, each step taking them further from their past and into the unknown. The journey was a nightmare brought to life, the darkness alive with unseen horrors that whispered just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Shadows moved independently of their sources, coalescing into forms that were too grotesque to be real, yet undeniably present. Mrs. Thompson kept Jenny close, her presence a constant reminder of what they were fighting to survive for. The road out of Eldridge was long, and with each step, the hope that had sparked their escape dimmed, overshadowed by the overwhelming reality of their situation. The darkness was not just in Eldridge. It was everywhere, a consuming entity that had swallowed the world whole. Their final stand, a desperate attempt to find light in a world where darkness reigned supreme, was a testament to the enduring human spirit, even when faced with the unimaginable. As the first light of what should have been morning crested over the horizon, the group halted in their tracks, a collective breath held in anticipation. But the light was wrong. It was not the warm, welcoming glow of the sun they had so desperately hoped for, but a cold, alien luminescence that painted the world in stark, unforgiving shades of gray. Mrs. Thompson, her heart sinking, realized then that the darkness had not been a veil to be lifted, but a permanent shroud over the earth. "It's all gone," she murmured, her voice breaking, as she gazed out over what should have been the promise of a new day. The realization that there was no escape from the night, that their final stand had been in vain, was a despair too profound to voice. Jenny, her hand slipping into her mother's, looked up with eyes that had seen too much. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice a small beacon of hope in the relentless gloom. Mrs. Thompson looked down at her daughter, the embodiment of all they had fought to protect, and knew she couldn't let the finality of their situation extinguish the spark within her. "No, my love," she said with a conviction she didn't feel. "It's not over. We'll find a way. We always do." The resolve in her voice was a fragile thing, but it was enough to push them forward into the bleak landscape that awaited them. But as they ventured further, a chilling revelation awaited them. The landscape around them, once teeming with life, was now silent, a stark, desolate expanse that stretched as far as the eye could see. The darkness had not just claimed the day, it had claimed everything, a relentless tide that left nothing untouched. And then, from the shadows, came a sound, soft at first, but growing steadily in volume, a laughter, low and cruel, as if the darkness itself was mocking their plight. It was in that moment, under the uncaring gaze of a forever blighted sky, that Mrs. Thompson understood the true horror of their situation. They were not alone. The darkness had a life of its own, and it had been waiting for them. The final twist of their journey was not the world they hoped to find, but the realization that they were the last remnants of humanity, a final flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness, and the night was eager to claim them as its own.